Ascension Day reminds us that we are in a time of transition. We remain in the midst of Easter, and yet something has now changed. Christ is still risen, and yet he is no longer with the disciples in person. Scripture tells us that the risen and transformed Jesus was only with them for a certain period before it was time to let go. The story of the Ascension is therefore both an ending and a beginning, serving as a lesson that, as so often in life, one chapter must close before another can open. Whilst framed within a miracle story, by definition something extraordinary and rare, nevertheless it concerns the all too common human experience of having to let go, saying goodbye. And here I am reminded of a saying I once heard from the theologian Marcus Borg, who himself had heard it from someone else sharing a sacred story from another tradition, another culture. The saying is this: I don't know if the story happened exactly this way, but I know that the story is true. And so, whilst I don't know if the Ascension story happened exactly this way, in fact some of the details seem quite magical and improbable to me, I know that it concerns the truth. Jesus says goodbye to his friends and followers, those who have faced so much with him, have travelled so far with him, but now they must part. It is a gentler kind of parting, previously denied to them, as he was instead ripped from their presence and almost immediately executed. It's the kind of alternative parting for which they must have longed. He says to them, "Thus it is written." This is the way it has to be. I must go, and you must stay. That is the way things are. One of the most difficult things in life is letting go, knowing when we can no longer hold on to those things about which we care so much. Yet if they are to flourish, if they are to truly grow, we must let them go. It is certainly something every parent must face. You raise your children as best you can. You sacrifice for them. You would give them everything, even die for them if you had to. But you cannot live their own lives for them. There are some things that they will have to face alone, some journeys that no one but them can undertake. Jesus has done what he could. He has taught his disciples all that they are able to understand. He has tried to equip them for the trials and difficulties ahead. But he can't hold their hands for them forever. They will never learn. They will never grow. They will never become the people they are meant to be unless he lets them walk on their own. Sometimes, perhaps often, they will stumble and fall, but at least it's their steps they are taking, their decisions they are making. For if the church was to have any future, it had to learn to stand on its own 2 feet. Inspired and guided by Jesus, of course, but it could only truly live if he let go and allowed his followers to grow on their own. So we are told that the disciples were on a high after the Ascension, fired with enthusiasm at the sight of Jesus' final journey. Well, certainly in retrospect, the Church has seen it as a time for great celebration. During the 4th century, a church was even built on the site commonly held to be the place of Ascension. and throughout the history of the Church she has used triumphal hymns and psalms to mark the joy of the occasion. But I wonder whether the first disciples were truly as overjoyed as the Acts of the Apostles reports them to be. Perhaps in hindsight the Church was able to reinterpret the events as joyful, knowing what it had come to know, believing what it had come to believe. But are we to suppose that there was no grief, no confusion, no soul-searching, no questions? On past performance, the disciples had not always been the most impressive of followers. Initially all dedication and zeal, the heart of their fervour seemed to cool off rather quickly in the face of adversity, or even Jesus leaving them for a few hours. So it's not unreasonable to suppose that they might have drifted off into small groups, asking themselves, so what do we do now? The truth is that the disciples would have achieved very little, but for the event that stands between us now and the Ascension. For if we can only truly understand the cross through the prism of Easter Day, then so too we must view the Ascension through the lens of Pentecost. For if the Ascension in part looks back, if in part it is a close, a completion and a finale, it is also a new beginning, an anticipation, a looking forward. Jesus' departure is not so much the conclusion, therefore, of a set of resurrection experiences, as it is the first action in the creation of a worldwide mission and witness by the Church in the power of the promised Spirit. Not a conclusion so much as a realization, not a finale, but an overture. Ascension is a time when we can reflect upon the theme of death and life, decay and rebirth, despair and new hope, ending and beginning the old and the new, that constantly runs throughout the history of the Church, its present and into its future. The Christian faith is not as it once was, it is changing now. And that process of letting go, only to take up anew, will continue as long as Christians gather and think and pray, and honestly and humbly bring their consciences to bear on the joys and despairs of each passing age. Ascension reminds us that our world, our church, our faith, and indeed our lives are in a constant state of flux. And this is the way it must be, if there is to be learning and growth and a future beyond the limits of our vision and our fears. We must embrace change, not fearing the loss, but trusting the Spirit to bring renewal and new life and new possibilities. But only if we too are ready and brave enough to let go and to trust and to hope.